Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 28. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 53 and 54, the prima pars, which is the local movement of the angels and the knowledge of the angels. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is a Second Revised Edition translated by the fathers of the English Dominican province. And so here we go. Article 1, whether an angel can move locally. Why are we splitting hairs with these seemingly small, inconsequential questions on the angels? Because the Summa for St. Thomas is intended to display, explain, and defend the Christian faith, and the existence of angels is of the faith. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" And in Matthew 18, he says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven." Therefore, if the location of angels or the local movement of angels implies a contradiction or leads to an absurdity, then we would have to reject the existence of angels altogether, which would be a rejection of the Catholic faith. Therefore, in order to defend the faith, we do actually have to defend the details of not only an angel's existence, but also their actions, at least to the point of showing that they are not contrary to reason. And so we proceed. Article 1. Can an angel be moved locally? This is the first time, to my knowledge, that we have encountered local movement in the Summa, which is a remarkably complex topic, believe it or not, just like time, just like change, just like existence. Local motion is also, in my opinion, one of those areas in which Aristotle and Aquinas are being vindicated contemporarily by secular science, such as, and what we see in quantum mechanics today, specifically in what they call superposition, which is how could it be true, it seems, that an electron can be in 2 different places at the exact same time. But let us begin our discussion of motion with Zeno, who's from around 430 BC, because Zeno's paradox on motion, which I will describe briefly, is what led to Aristotle's response, and so to Aquinas' stance on motion, and what I think we're returning to in part in the 21st century. For Zeno, motion was impossible, and he had good reasons for believing that. He's ultimately wrong, but his arguments are worthy for discussion. For Zeno, for me to move my hand from in front of my left shoulder to in front of my right shoulder, my hand has to actually, keyword there, pass through halfway between those 2 points. Now, that seems reasonable enough. But before it can do that, it would first have to pass through a halfway of that halfway as well, ad infinitum. So for anything to move at all, according to Zeno, it would have to pass through an infinite number of halfway points, which cannot be done in any definite amount of time. Therefore, motion is impossible. And his argument follows. And it proves that motion is more like teleportation. As an analogy, please don't take that analogy too seriously, though it's a useful one, because in reality, things don't actually pass through those infinite halfway points, but only potentially. But there is that word, potential, potency, given to us by Aristotle and being vindicated in our day by quantum mechanics, and necessary to explain motion. If I could phrase what we've said about motion thus far in another way, when my hand is in motion from point A to point B, it is in one way neither at A or B, but also in another way both at A and B as well. There's your explanation for quantum superposition. That motion is continuous, or a continuum. My hand is at point B potentially, which is then actualized over time. Now, we would probably need an entire podcast dedicated to motion to say more, but for our purposes, let us simply take Aristotle's definition on motion and then take a look at our article. Motion is, according to Aristotle, the actuality of what is in potentiality insofar as it is in potentiality. So, can angels be moved locally? Aquinas in his writings will remind us that local motion is a continuum, as that definition implies, and escaping Zeno's paradox. Then he will say how this can work with angels, along with then giving another way angels could be said to move locally, which is by simply ceasing to affect one place and then beginning to affect another. So here's Aquinas from the Gilby translation. And so just as a body moving locally does not leave its first position at once, but successively, and thus moves with the continuity proper to bodily motion, so too an angel, moving from a place divisible into parts, may leave it successively. In this sense, the angelical movement too may be continuous, but it may, on the other hand, take place as an instantaneous transference of power from the whole of one place to the whole of another. In this case, the angel's movement would be discontinuous. Now, hopefully my explanation previous to that citation was helpful in making that citation more intelligible. Article 2, whether an angel passes through an intermediate place. Well, it depends, because angels can move locally, like we do, through a continuum, through this actualization of being in place B potentially, but they can also move by simply stopping to affect place A and then beginning to affect place B, as we've said before. In the first case, they would pass through some intermediate. In the second case, they would not. That is our response to this article. As an aside, Aquinas spills an incredible amount of ink on this question because it does respond directly to Zeno's paradox, which I imagine he feels he needs to do thoroughly. So here is a brief synopsis from Aquinas on that problem of Zeno and the solution, Gilby translation again, for its clarity. Imagine a body moving through 2 feet of space. Clearly, when the body starts to move, it gradually leaves the beginning of that length and then invades the end of it. Hence, since any length is infinitely divisible, and the points in any length are potentially infinite, it follows that between any 2 places there is an infinity of intermediate places. Now, in order to cross an infinity of intermediaries, a moving thing must move continuously. For just as intermediate places are potentially infinite, so also continuous movement is potentially divisible to infinity. If then the movement be discontinuous, all the parts which compose it must amount to an actual definite number, from which it follows that it passes through an actually infinite number of them, which is impossible. In brief, we can say motion is either, as described by Aristotle above, something continuous, the actualization of a potential over time, or it is impossible. And since clearly motion is possible, it must occur, as Aristotle and Aquinas understood it. Article 3, whether the movement of an angel is instantaneous. Again, it depends on what kind of movement we're referring to. If it is an angel affecting one place and then ceasing to affect that place and beginning to affect another, then change can be instantaneous. If the movement is like the way we move locally, then the movement is not instantaneous but actualized over time, and in the manner we have described already, impossibly for the listener, painstakingly detailed fashion in these last 2 articles of the question. Let us move on to question 54, the knowledge of angels. Article 1, whether an angel's act of understanding is his substance. Remember that God's act of knowing is identical with his essence because of his simplicity, his lack of composition. As the Catholic faith teaches, all is one in God, where there is no opposition of relations, all of which will be familiar to the regular listener of this podcast. In this article, we ask if this is also the case with angels. Aquinas says no, and then it gives 3 reasons. First, if an angel's understanding was identical to its being, then its intellect would exist in itself, which there could in principle only be one of. Similar to how each angel must be its own species in order to be distinct or unique, you'll remember that from a previous episode, and the one subsisting, existing in itself intelligence, well, that's already taken. That is God. The second reason, because our actions only potentially exist until we actually act. Like you have the potential to speak and then actually choose to speak at certain times. So for a thing's being to be identical with its actions would mean that it acts without potential, which again is reserved to that one thing devoid of potential, which is God alone. Third reason, if an angel's act of knowing was identical to its being, there would be no potential for knowing more or less perfectly, which is a potential which angels have as revealed by the faith and known by reason, since not being God, the angels are not omniscient. Article 2, whether the knowledge of angels is its being. God, whose act of knowing is identical with his being, is also the object of his knowing. So God is identical with his act of knowing, and what he knows is himself. The latter of these two is the question of this article. Is the knowledge of the angel its being? No, because the nature of angels is limited, but what it can know is in a sense unlimited. An angel could continue learning like the eye can continue seeing different colored things. The discrepancy between those two, the angel's limited being and its potentially unlimited knowing, is sufficient to prove Aquinas' position in this article. Article 3, whether an angel's power of intelligence is his essence. As you can probably tell by this point, the purpose of these articles is to demonstrate that angels are not God, specifically here in question 54 in regard to their intellectual ability. Looking at this article, what Aquinas means by faculties or powers is the ability to act in some way. So the stone does not have the faculty of reason. It cannot generate a syllogism. It cannot move from premises to their logical conclusions. We can do that. We have the faculty of intellection, and nothing else down here does. The question here is the power of intelligence identical to an angel's essence? Aquinas responds, in every creature the essence differs from the existence. In the angel, to understand is not the same as to exist, nor is any operation in him, nor in any other created thing the same as his existence. Hence the angel's essence is not his power of intelligence, nor is the essence of any creature its power of operation. These terms, essence and existence, in short, are what a thing is, that's essence, that it is, existence. What is a unicorn? It's a horse with a horn. That would be its essence if it existed, but it does not exist. Therefore, essence and existence can be considered distinctly. They do have a distinction among them, between them. Essence limits existence to a particular manner of existing, to the particular faculties, particular potentials of a thing. Existence as limited by the essence of humanity is you and I. God's existence is unlimited in all ways. Therefore, we can say he has no essence, or we can say his essence simply is existence. An angel, being a creature, is not existence itself, or an essence that is identical to existence, and therefore it has distinctions within its being, such as the distinction between its capacity to know and its essence, which is what Aquinas is saying in this article. An angel's power of intelligence is not identical with its essence. Article 4, whether there is an active and a passive intellect in an angel. Like motion, this is an important topic for the future of the Summa, or just broadly speaking in the realm of epistemology. How do we know things? Human cognition. And for the crash course on that, I would return to episode 7 on the beatific vision, where we cover that. What is the passive and active intellect? Let's begin with Aristotle. From his work titled On the Soul, he writes, in the soul, there is something whereby it can become all things, and there is something whereby it can make all things. So when you know the tree, the essence of the tree out there in the world must also be in you for you to know it, for you to know the tree. What in you makes that essence in the mind, and what in the mind takes on that essence so that you can know it, is the active and passive intellect. What abstracts the essence of tree, the underlying idea of it, from your sense perception and as held in the imagination, is what we call the active intellect, a power of the mind. Then what is informed in you by that essence, that which takes on or holds that abstract concept, allowing you to understand it, is what we mean by the passive intellect. And if that was a lot in a short amount of time, no worries. We will see it all again when we treat of human cognition around question 75. However, I think it would be beneficial to quote Aquinas at length here when he describes the two, because this topic is so important for human cognition and for the road ahead. Then we'll answer this article. Aquinas writes, "The necessity for admitting a passive intellect in us is derived from the fact that we understand sometimes only potentially and not actually. Hence there must exist some power which, previous to the act of understanding, is in potential to intelligible things, but which becomes actuated in their regard when it apprehends them, and still more when it reflects upon them. This is the power which is named the passive intellect. Moreover, the necessity for admitting an active intellect is due to this, that the natures or essences of material things which we understand do not exist outside the soul as immaterial and actually knowable, but are only knowable potentially, so long as they are outside the soul. Consequently, it is necessary that there should be some power capable of rendering such natures actually intelligible, and this power in us is called the active intellect." Again, if that's difficult to catch at first glance, no worries, we will see it all again soon. Do angels have these powers, active and passive in the intellect? It seems like they would not need them, since it is our body which limits us to thinking about one thing at one time. It is our body which requires us to receive knowledge through the senses and through means of abstraction, understanding the essence of things. For these reasons, and because an angel is not restricted by the body, the answer to this article is in the negative. Last article of this question, Article 5, whether there is only intellectual knowledge in the angels. Angels do not have bodies. How do they know particular things? You and I know particular people by seeing them, not by the intellectual knowledge of humanness or the concept of humanity in the mind. We know particular people by the coordination of sense knowledge, so seeing the particular person in front of us, and intellectual knowledge, knowing the kind of thing it is, knowing the abstract essence of things. Angels do not have sense knowledge because they do not have senses, because they do not have bodies. And so how they know particular things is going to be an interesting question to come. But for now, to answer our current article, we can say that yes, the only knowledge that angels have is intellectual knowledge, or an immaterial knowledge of things, because they are themselves entirely immaterial kind of things. In the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, "Now the angels have no bodies naturally joined to them, as is manifest from what has already been said. Hence, only the powers of intellect and will can belong to them." And that does it for this episode. Let us ask our guardian angel to enlighten us regarding it. We have just finished questions 53 and 54, the prima pars, that is, the local movement of the angels and the knowledge of the angels. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.